Well, good morning, all. And thank you all for joining us this morning. A little bit of rain, a little bit of wet, but I think we all ended up getting to where we needed to be at the time. Let me first of all begin by thanking my colleague for his many years of serving as co-chair of this caucus and the many years that he has advocated for social justice for all of the Sri Lankans, not only in the country, but around the world. Purpose of our Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka to serve as a group of members dedicated to issues related to protecting the rights and identity of ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka, including Tamils, Christians, Muslims, and others who are being excluded from society, the economy and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. The caucus briefing is to educate our members of Congress, staff, and others regarding these subjects and current events. According to the Human Rights Watch, the fundamental human rights in Sri Lanka has been in serious jeopardy under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa presidency that has stymied accountability for human rights abuses that were linked to the 26-year civil war and ended in 2009. Victims of past abuses, their families, and human rights advocates are subjected to surveillance, intimidation, and persecution. Muslims, Tamils, Christians, and others are demanding justice from the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government speaks of peace and justice for all, but what my elders have said long ago, what you do speaks so loudly until I can barely hear what you say. I am reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "In your struggle for justice, let your oppressor know that you're not attempting to defeat or humiliate him or her, or even to pay him back for injustices that he has heaped upon you. Let him know that you're merely seeking justice for him as well as for yourself." So with that, I want to introduce our guest speakers today. C.V. Wingura, a member of Parliament, former Supreme Court judge and Chief Minister of Northern Provincial Council in Sri Lanka. Dr. Kate Croonan Furman, Professor of Human Rights at the University College in London. Ms. Anushana Aligara, Co-Director, Adalam Center for Policy Studies in Jaffa. Mr. V.S.S. Stamanchan Esquire, Human Rights Defender, Sri Lanka. And Ms. Melissa Wilson Esquire, Human Rights Lawyer in Toronto. So let us then, if my colleague comes in, then we'll just pause for him to make an opening statement. But in the meantime, why don't we just go ahead and begin with C.V. Wingura.
Danny, I'm here.
Okay, Bill.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. And I'm sorry for being late. It's kind of a crazy day here on Capitol Hill. Danny, thanks for your kind words there. I appreciate that. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Congressman Bill Johnson, and thanks for attending today's important briefing on the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka. As you know, we're focusing on the continued destruction of ethnic and religious communities. And I am so proud to co-chair the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka with my friend, colleague, Danny Davis. We founded this caucus in 2013 to increase awareness and educate other members of Congress on the protection of rights of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. The mission of our caucus remains not only relevant, but critical. A report released just a few days ago by the UN Human Rights Council notes continuing trends towards militarization and ethno-religious nationalism that undermine democratic institutions, increase the anxiety of minorities, and impede reconciliation. The report also noted, and I quote, the pattern of surveillance and harassment by security forces of civil society organizations, journalists, and victims, which has also been emphasized in prior reports, has also continued, particularly in the North and East, where several of Sri Lanka's minority communities live. I recently met with Sri Lanka's newly appointed ambassador to the US, Mahinda Sumarasinghe. I've met with several ambassadors, in fact, in the past, but this meeting was different. This time, the ambassador stated that Sri Lanka wants to demonstrate its commitment to action and not simply put out rhetoric on unmet commitments for transitional justice and reconciliation. One of the areas that he mentioned was amending the Prevention of Terrorism Act and their desire to be in line with the international best practices. I'm encouraged to see in the UN High Commissioner's report that the Sri Lankan government has taken initial steps to amend the PTA, including offering some amendments that would make positive and meaningful change. However, it's also clear that problematic provisions of the PTA would not be amended by the government's current proposal. So clearly more work needs to be done to address the injustices imposed by the PTA. But I look forward to hearing from today's esteemed speakers on this and other critical issues faced by Sri Lanka's minority communities. And I'm hopeful that the UN report can be used as a tool for the Sri Lankan government to take action on outstanding commitments for justice, accountability, and reconciliation, if that truly is their intention. So with that, let's continue on.
All right, thank you, Bill. And I knew you would be here. It was just a matter of a few seconds.
You bet. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you. We'll begin with the Member of Parliament, C.V. Wigner Warren, and I probably butchered your name, but thank you very much, sir, and let's go ahead and start.
To participate in this Zoom meeting. The subject identified for this meeting is destruction of ethnic and religious communities in Sri Lanka and the role of the state. The UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in September 2007. The declaration protects indigenous people's rights to their collective biocultural heritage as a whole, including traditional knowledge and resources, territories, and cultural and spiritual values and customary laws. Although its provisions are not legally binding, 146 countries adopted the declaration and so have committed to respecting it. Sri Lanka has committed itself to respect the declaration. Speaking about territorial rights, Article 26 of the declaration states that indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. They have the right to own, use, develop, and control these. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. So in a land where there is so much of land grabbing, I'm trying to point this out. Further, indigenous people have the right to self-determination according to Article 3. In fact, the Article 1 of Part 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that all peoples have the right of self-determination. by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural developments. Although there is no fully accepted definition of peoples, the Tamils of the north and east of Sri Lanka having determinable areas of traditional homelands, a language, culture, and way of life of their own, must certainly fall within the category of people. The Tamils of the north and east of Sri Lanka are the original inhabitants of Sri Lanka. According to historians Indrapala, Padmanathan, Pushparatnam, and others, there are sufficient evidence now, especially within the last 20-30 years, to show the Tamils lived in the island from over 3,000 years ago. I will not go into details. This is not the time for it. Just as recent excavations in Keeladi in Madurai in South India point to an ancient Tamil civilization there, there is evidence to show the way of life of the Tamils of Sri Lanka and South India at that time, 3,000 years ago, was similar. Sinhala as a language is a very recent one. It is a mixture of Tamil, Pali, Sanskrit, and certain dialects of that time during 6th and 7th centuries AD. Its first grammar book came out in the 13th century Anno Domini. There could not have been Sinhalese living on this island before the Sinhala language came into being. Buddhism was introduced to Tamil kings in pre-Christian times. The only way by which the present-day Sinhalese try to make out they were living at the time of the introduction of Buddhism is by referring to a Buddhist fictional publication called Mahavamsa, written in the Pali language in the 5th century AD by a Buddhist priest. There is no reference to a Sinhala language or Sinhala community in the Mahavamsa. The word Sihala, being the Pali word for lion, appears just once. Sinhalese and Tamils are the descendants of the ancient people who lived during the Lemurian continent, which went under water centuries ago, and the other Tamils like the Pandyas, Pallavas, and Cholas, who time to time took control of this island. The recent DNA tests have proved the fact of common ancestorship. Nevertheless, the Sinhalese, since the time of independence, and even before that, have resorted to many dubious acts to undermine the Tamils and their way of life. It was the late D.S. Senanayake, the so-called father of the nation, who made sure that the Salisbury commissioners sent to draft a new constitution for Ceylon by the British king did not grant a federal constitution. A book on D.S. Senanayake by H.A.G. Hulugalla brings out the details of what Mr. Senanayake did to ensure Ceylon did not get a federal constitution. Because the constitution granted was a unitary constitution, it allowed for the majority community, the Sinhalese, controlling more seats under the territorial representation system to ride roughshod over the minorities. Sinhala only was foisted on the Tamil-speaking people, who were the overwhelming majority in the north and east. Lands in the traditional homelands of the Tamils were colonized with Sinhala settlers from the deep south. Resources were expropriated. Standardization in higher education was introduced to decrease the intake of studious Tamils into universities. Military was sent to the north to quell all opposition to the passing of the Sinhala Only Act as far back as in 1961, and they continued to be there. In time, the youth took up to arms and a war raged for 30 years. Now we are in the post-war period. 13 years have passed, but there has been no attempt at demilitarization or security sector reforms. Land grabbing is going on at a fast rate. Expropriation of our resources is taking place with the help of military stationed in the north and east in large numbers. It is estimated, inter alia, that over 65,000 acres of state lands are held by the military, numbering over 100,000. The military is involved in agriculture directly and fishing by proxy to the detriment of the interests of the Tamil speakers. As Israeli professor Oren Yiftachel says, although ethnocratic states present themselves as democracies, their aim is to establish an ethnicization of contested territory and power apparatus. Oren Yiftachel defines the ethnocracy as a regime facilitating the expansion, ethnicization, and control of contested territory and state by a dominant ethnic nation. Ethnocratic states exercise selective openness and have a range of partial democratic features. Through his research, Oren Yiftachel establishes Sri Lanka as an ethnocratic state. Presently, gerrymandering is going on to ultimately deface Tamil political representation altogether. The modus operandi is the creation of a new constitution to lay the foundation for a Sinhala Buddhist country. All these acts to undermine the existence of the minorities, and especially the Tamils, are articulated and orchestrated by the state. Tamil and Muslim people can never live with equality, dignity, and respect in such an ethnocratic state. We have already lost our land, our identity, our people to a large extent in the last 70 years since independence. Almost a million of our people are now abroad. If we continue to live in the ethnocratic Sri Lankan state, we will completely lose our existence and identity for some time to come. Therefore, in Sri Lanka, the international community must take appropriate actions without delay to hold a referendum in the north and east to find a solution that our people want. I do not believe that Sri Lanka has any chance of getting rid of its ethnocratic structures. Thank you. Hello? Hello?
Dr.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Kate Cronin Foreman.
Thank you, Congressman. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. So I'm both a human rights lawyer and a political scientist, but today I'm going to speak primarily in my capacity as a political scientist, and specifically as a political scientist who studies systemic human rights violations and mass atrocities in deeply divided societies like Sri Lanka's. I know that the other speakers today are going to be able to give a much more detailed picture of the situation on the ground. So I'm instead going to focus on some of the political dynamics that underlie the repression and inequalities that they'll describe, and also quickly discuss how these dynamics affect prospects for improving the situation. So, as the Chief Minister just mentioned, Sri Lanka has a type of political system that scholars generally refer to as ethnocracy. And the characteristics of ethnocracy are first, that it is membership in the dominant ethnic group and not citizenship that determines access to resources and power. And then second, that the dominant ethnic group controls the state apparatus and so is able to shape the political system and the country's legal system more broadly to entrench their superior position. And troublingly, this often means that the state security forces' primary function is in fact the protection of the majority ethnic group's control, rather than peace, territorial integrity, or even the state's geostrategic interests. So this has really significant consequences for how the state deploys violence within its borders. Consequences that range from the different treatment of peaceful protesters, depending on whether they're members of the majority community or not, to the expansion of counterinsurgency campaigns into attacks on minority civilian populations. Now, obviously, in the Sri Lankan case specifically, we saw such extensive and systematic targeting of Tamil civilians during and after the war that when we read that alongside the history of state violence and restrictions on Tamil political rights, it raises the question of whether there might in fact have been genocidal aims at play. And this reflects the fact that even when ethnocratic regimes are at peace and are formally democratic, so hold elections and tolerate a free press, The reality is that it is only members of the dominant group who are viewed as full members of the polity. And members of other groups therefore lack the complete panoply of citizenship rights. And this dynamic is really easy to observe in Sri Lanka, stretching back to the moment of independence, continuing to this day. So there's a clear through line, for instance, from the Sinhala Only Act of 1956 that the Chief Minister just mentioned, which severely disadvantaged the Tamil-speaking population, to the One Country, One Law Legal Reform Task Force that was just created last year with a militant Islamophobic monk appointed as its leader. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the less obvious implications of ethnocratic rule. So it's probably fairly clear that we get this type of system, ethnocracy, in very deeply divided societies. What may be less clear is that ethnocratic regimes have a vested interest in keeping those societies divided. And so their leaders will intentionally foment ethnic tensions to protect their position in power. So what this means is that in ethnocratic societies that are electoral democracies, like Sri Lanka, moments when the regime perceives itself to be losing support can be very, very dangerous for minorities. Regimes that think their hold on power is weakening may decline to suppress anti-minority violence. They may engage in ethnic scapegoating themselves to shift the blame away from their own governance failures. And they may even use crackdowns on unpopular minorities' rights, so for instance, Muslim religious rights, to shore up their support with the majority. And I bring this up today because Sri Lanka is currently experiencing the worst economic crisis the country has faced in decades, with critical shortages of essential goods, skyrocketing consumer prices. Public approval of this government has diminished significantly. And this makes it a really dangerous moment for the Tamil and Muslim communities, whose rights, which are always limited and contingent in the context of a Sinhala Buddhist state, will now become even more politically inconvenient to a government that fears for its future. So unfortunately, this also means that we are very unlikely to see any movement on remedies for past human rights abuses committed against the Tamil and Muslim communities. So obviously, we've just heard mention of the UN Human Rights Council. Sri Lanka continues to be sharply criticized by members of the international community for its failure to deliver on promises of accountability for wartime abuses. And of course, it's important for us to emphasize this failure and to acknowledge the suffering of victims under conditions of impunity. But this is not a state that is going to respond to pressure to do more on this issue. And so engagement should not be focused on pushing for domestic action for accountability. Instead, I think we need to take seriously the fact that it is the same conditions on the ground that perpetuate impunity for past atrocities that also increase the likelihood of new violations. So I'm going to conclude today by asking that the members of the caucus prioritize measures that can provide some prospective protection to Sri Lankans who are vulnerable to state violence, which of course disproportionately means members of the Tamil and Muslim communities. And I think the other speakers today will likely have a number of very specific policy asks in this vein, but I'd like to just flag one issue, which is the ongoing relationship between the US military and Sri Lanka's unvetted security sector. And here, I'm not just speaking as a political scientist, but as a human rights worker who has met personally with victims of war crimes that were ordered by individuals who remain in command of Sri Lanka's military, and also as an American voter, because I do not want my tax dollars supporting military engagement with forces that stand credibly accused of some of the most serious crimes against international law. So I'll close there. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions given the presentation that you've just made. And now we will go to Ms. Nushani Alagarjar, co-director of the Adlam Center for Policy Studies.
Thank you, co-chairs, for the invitation to speak today. I will focus on the security issues faced by human rights defenders, especially the families of the disappeared, as they marked their 5 years of protest demanding answers last month. Tamil families of people who were disappeared during Sri Lanka's armed conflict have increasingly been targeted for harassment by Sri Lankan security forces in the recent years, with a notable increase since 2015 and specifically after 2017 when the families started to protest across the Tamil homeland, demanding answers and justice. Our conversations with the leaders of the families of the disappeared in the last 2 months proves that the harassment has not only increased since the election of the new government, but also carried out in a systemic, pervasive manner. The Sri Lankan police, military, and intelligence forces, along with the informers, have used increasing pressure on leading activists in associations of the families of the disappeared, who are predominantly women, through more and more severe threats and harassment that are intended to deter and silence existing and future activism. To break this down further, the state has used all units of its security forces and members of the government institutions to threaten, harass, and surveil the activists. They have used quote-unquote official threatening mechanisms, such as frequent inquiries, house visits, court orders prohibiting them from holding events and gatherings, threats of arresting them under the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, and phone calls from government intelligence agents, as well as consistent military surveillance during protests. Even during pandemic lockdowns, leading activists in the north received visits from intelligence agents and sometimes called to appear at the Terrorism Investigation Division head office in Colombo for investigation. The families of the disappeared and many other activists who face such harassment and intimidation are often asked about their activities, the people they meet, the diaspora context, funding sources for the protest, their financial activities, personal details of family members, and so on. There are also quote-unquote unofficial or indirect harassment tactics, such as intelligence officers stationing or patrolling the houses or offices of the disappearance activist, inquiring and threatening families, friends, neighbors, supporters of the activist, and using the general fear of arrests and PTA to cause more fear. Even though many of these women have gotten so used to personal threats and harassment, threats to the family members' security go beyond what most are willing to risk. The majority of women we spoke to have stepped down from their leadership roles and stopped being involved publicly or even entirely. They have also expressed serious concerns about the success of these intimidation tactics, which have resulted in some of the district associations losing members and leaders due to the need to protect remaining family members. Constant intimidation and being prohibited from openly planning and participating in community events has significantly impacted disappearance activists' psychological well-being. It also threatens the sense of comfort and safety these very tired families find in community gatherings and collective action. Constant surveillance, inquiries, and phone calls, not just to the families of the disappeared, but also to the neighbors, friends, and relatives, have served to amplify the isolation of the pandemic and have made families feel like outsiders in their own communities. In one mother's words, when you serve someone a court order, everyone thinks that this person has done something terrible or broken the law. We are being served court orders for only planning demonstrations and holding press meetings. We just want to see our family. This is in direct contradiction to what the state said in international forums about protecting civil society space and working with human rights defenders, just like how the statements about functioning Office of Missing Persons are contradictory to the reality. Even though the families of the disappeared in the North and East are rejecting the Office of the Missing Persons and believe that the office is for a show to satisfy the international community's demands, even the smallest number of families who wanted to engage with the OMP are left with disappointment due to the lack of trust in the office and the security and bureaucratic challenges they faced in terms of accessing their services. We are concerned that if this pattern of strategic intimidation and harassment continues, we will not have a well-functioning, active civic community that can challenge the state's narratives about the human rights situation. It is also notable that the minority women are the most affected by it. The women who were in the front lines of the struggle for years are now tired and further exhausted by the attacks on their physical, mental, and psychological safety, and it is our duty to support them and ease their burden while they are still alive. Grassroots organizations, groups, and initiatives organized by victim and survivor communities should be supported, should be included in decision-making processes, should be consulted about the current UNHRC resolution and its implementation, and should be given better complaining mechanisms and safe spaces to exercise their right to dissent and demand justice. The state must be held accountable for the promises they make at international platforms and for actively targeting and using fear-mongering tactics against the civil society members and especially against the families of the disappeared. I hope your office continues to directly engage with ethnic and religious minorities on the island and monitor the situation closely. I request your government to ensure that justice and accountability remains the top priority, and the military engagement with Sri Lanka is conditional based on their compliance with security sector reform, demilitarization, returning of lands, and ending culture of impunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now go to Mr. VSS Thanachayan, Esquire.
Nevarakam Vanakkam. Good evening to you all. First of all, my sincere thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me to address the land issues that we are facing in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. In my speech, I would like to touch three main points. The first one is the relationship of the government departments in terms of land issues in Sri Lanka, especially in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. And the second one is the state-sponsored singularization that is happening in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. And the third one, how these land issues are affecting the innocent Tamil minority people who are living in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. It is evident that even from my honorable C.V. Vignesan sir has illustrated that there are historical evidence that Tamils are the indigenous native people of Sri Lanka. Since Tamils are the minorities, they are being targeted. They have contributed much to the independence, but after the independence, they have been targeted in many aspects. That is the main reason for the Tamils to take up the arms and to engage in a sort of armed struggle for their liberation. And land was the centerpiece, and land was regarded as the main issue in terms of the liberation, because the land and the territory, the boundary, which gives the basic safety and basic safeguard to the people, to any people, even if they are minority people who are living in a state. So in the present context, the state departments, the government departments are engaged in a manner to acquire the land, grab the land from the native Tamil people who are living in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. There are many departments I can directly mention. For example, the archaeological department, the forest department, wildlife department, the Mahavali authority, and some other authorities. There are many authorities which are engaged in order to get the lands from the native Tamil people, and they want to make a difference. They want to make a change in the demographic structure of the people. Especially when it comes to the Mahavali authority. I think in my understanding, under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the land and police powers have been shared to the provincial councils. But there are cases, even after 1987, there are cases. I can mention the very landmark and well-known case, Solemuthu Rasu case, in which the Supreme Court has very clearly held that the land powers are vested with the central government and it cannot be shared to the provincial councils. So if we have the land rights to the provincial councils, then we can serve our lands in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. On the other hand, the land powers are given to the Mahawali authority. In my understanding, if we compare the provincial council system on the one hand and the Mahawali authority in the other hand, the Mahawali authority is having a huge power in terms of land in this country. So this is a serious issue and serious, it makes serious consequences, especially in the border areas of northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. When it comes to, for example, if we take Mullaitivu, actually I'm from Mullaitivu. My native place is Mullaitivu, which is in the border area of northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka, northern and eastern provinces. So there are many new villages, new singular cities, villages have been established after 2009. And a lot of singular people have been encouraged to civilize and come and live in the native Tamil lands. In those areas, the Mahawali authority is getting as per the law, they are requesting the people to get all the land, hand over all the lands to the government, and they are distributing in an unproportionate manner to the people. They are getting more lands from Tamil people, and they are giving a small portion of the lands back to Tamil people. So with this, they would like to make a change in the demographic structure of the people. And it will result in the future elections, and there will be more singular representation in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. And the other important issue is, so when the British left Sri Lanka, if you see in 1948, the percentage of singular people who are living in the Trincomalee district is around 1%. Now, if we see the current number of people or the current rate, it is almost 1/3 of the total population. So in the near future, there will be a huge change in the Trincomalee district, and definitely now we have one parliamentarian from Trincomalee district, we will lose that as well. This threat has been shared to other Vani districts as well, to Mullaitivu district, to Vaunia district, Mannar district, and other districts as well. So we are going to lose our political representation also through this singular judicialization in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. And when it comes to the lands, we have these private lands and the state lands and or permit lands. There are, in many places, there are private lands, the lands which are fully owned by the private persons, private people, individuals are seized or acquired by the government with different schedules, with different circulars, in different names, and those lands are not again handed back to the people. And specifically in Mullaitivu districts and in other districts, in Vandi districts, most of the land are occupied by the Sri Lankan military, and there are many camps, and which those camps occur and include many hectares of paddy lands and people's own land, which are not handed over back to the people. Even we have come and settled here for more than 12 or 13 years. These kind of issues, again, giving much more stress on the livelihood of the people. There are lakhs of people who have went out of Sri Lanka and living in other countries. Again, in this, with this economic crisis and with this economic condition, the Tamil people also thinking about going out of Sri Lanka and having a life, because they have both issues, the economical issues on the one hand and the military occupation. They don't have their lands in their hand, and with the government pressure, again, the minority people, they think that they don't have a good space, they don't have security, they don't have future in this land. And today, many even graduates, they are applying for master degrees and they are willing to fly out of this country. They don't foresee a good life in this country. Due to this, it's a structural one. The government has planned the departments and the other organizations in a manner to restrict the Tamil people and giving more pressure to the Tamil people. Due to that, the Tamil people don't have independent or quite economical stability in this country to have a good life. The foreign states are giving many loans to the state of Sri Lanka in the last few years. When the states are giving loans, those states, especially if we can take US, so most of the states, yes, I agree. Most of the states, they don't have conditions when they are giving loans. So if the states are putting conditions on the state in terms of human rights standards, in terms of protection of the minorities, or in terms of the some of the other safeguards, then the Sri Lankan government also change its path and may think about an equal or democratic governance in this country, and the government may make sure the rule of law. On the other hand, we have as recommendation, recently I have worked with Pearl and INGO in terms of the land acquisition and the issues with regard to Mahawali Authority. And there we have analyzed all the issues, and many of the lands still in the hands of the Mahawali Authority, and those lands are not handed over back to the native people. So this kind of Mahawali Authority Act and its powers may be repealed through the conditions of the states. And also, when it comes to the singular Britishization, it seems an ongoing process in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka, and the states may impose conditions in terms of restricting the singular Britishization or changing the nature of the number of people or the demographic structure in the northern and eastern side of Sri Lanka. Thank you. And I would like to take, I'm happy to answer any questions if it is raised by the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now go to Ms. Malaha Wilson, Esquire, human rights lawyer from Toronto.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I want to start off by saying that Sri Lanka has been universally condemned for its lack of adherence to human rights norms, most recently by the UNHRC High Commissioner, before that by the Special Rapporteur for Religions and Beliefs. The existing thinking is that Sri Lanka is is dominated by Sinhalese nationalism and Buddhism, with the state as a, shall we say, co-conspirator with respect to all of this. Another thing that should be as a foundation for what I'm going to say that should be noted is that the Sri Lankan Constitution and other laws around Buddhism refer to Buddhism as the foremost religion. However, the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka in 2003 stated that only Buddhism will have the protection of the state. To understand Sri Lanka, I think it's, before I give some examples of religious and ethnic intolerance, I think it's important to sort of pick up on something that the Chief Minister alluded to. The issue arose actually before independence, between the two wars. In the 1930s, there was an incursion of Germans into Sri Lanka, where this notion of the Sinhalese being Aryans was raised, because obviously at that time the Germans were on about the Aryan race, when in fact the issue is language. And then that took fruit post-independence. All of this is discussed in some detail in Professor A.J. Wilson's book, The Breakup of Sri Lanka. So anyway, given the fact that the fundamental construct of Sri Lanka is essentially racist, it's no surprise that we find ourselves here today. Some examples, quick examples of religious intolerance, which is well known to everybody here, is the forced cremation of Muslims arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the systemic harassment and abuse of Christians and Hindus, and the inability of and Muslims of any of these organizations to build buildings, etc., without getting the permission, in effect, of Buddhist monks and Buddhist temples. So that is, in fact, how the whole religious and ethnic construct is set up. But I want to focus specifically on how archaeology has been used to effect colonization and what could be referred to as cultural genocide in Sri Lanka. So in 2019, President Rajapaksa set up this 12-member presidential task force for archaeological heritage management in the Eastern Province, which is composed of Tamils and Sinhalese. The task force was composed entirely of Sinhalese Buddhists. And there were further additions to it, and there were Sinhala Buddhist monks who were added to this task force. And keep in mind, this was a task force that was supposed to study archaeology in predominantly Tamil and Muslim areas. So no surprise, as a result, various Buddhist archaeological sites were found. Lands were taken away from Tamils and Sinhalese. These had been their traditional farmlands. No compensation in many cases was afforded. There were court cases. Others would know better whether those court cases have ever ended. And as an asterisk, one point to keep in mind is when the British left Sri Lanka, although claiming to set up a democracy, I wouldn't say liberal, but let's say a democracy, they failed to set up one of the most fundamental tenets of a democracy, an independent judiciary, and the systemic institutional safeguards that go with that. So in any case, this task force has been used as a colonization mechanism. So a Buddhist vihara or a temple is quote unquote discovered, land is taken away from the traditional inhabitants of the area, and Sinhalese people are brought in because, of course, this must have been a Sinhalese area, and the colonizers and recent immigrants were who else but the Tamils and the Muslims. This is a false premise, and there's no scientific evidence to match this up. And so this goes on. And along with the Mahaveli project, is used as an instrument to remove Tamils and Muslims from their traditional homelands. It's interesting to note that that in July 10th of 2019, the task force said There's up to 2,000 sites in the Eastern Province that would be subject to examination, i.e. being Buddhist, that Buddhist artifacts were found at the historic Koneswaran Hindu temple, and they should be protected. And this was nothing but a blatant land grab. So question is, where do we go from here? How can we effect protections? I think it is naive to think that the state will provide any protection at all. They have not done so since independence. It has been a downward spiral. So what we have left is UN mechanisms, international courts, and where there are individuals who have perpetrated human rights violations, the provisions of the Global Magnitsky Act. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And now we will open up a period for questions. And I'd like to ask my colleague, Representative Johnson, Bill, if you have any questions, you could go right ahead and start.
Hi, Congressman. Unfortunately, the Congressman Johnson was not able to stay for this last piece, but I have a question for all of the panelists, if you don't mind. I heard mention that there needs to be more conditions on loans to Sri Lanka. Are there any other examples of things that you think the US or the international community need to be doing right now to better the conditions or to put more pressure on the Sri Lankan government to fulfill their commitments for human rights? Open to everybody.
I can, if you, sorry, I'm happy to answer that. As I said, I think what's important is sanctions on individuals, because to date there has been impunity. And the second point I would make is support from the US in terms of our work at the UNHRC and perhaps taking the matter up further.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other response to that question?
Yeah, I'll respond as well. Yeah, I think I would echo that the kind of global Magnitsky sanctions that have been imposed so far have been very impactful. So I think broadening that effort, and also, you know, as I said in my remarks, I feel very strongly that curtailing military engagement with the security sector is an absolute priority.
Well, then I've got a question. Dr. Furman, I was intrigued by your description of ethnocracies and how they function. And historically, do we have any examples of where this type of governing entity has actually made good, solid progress?
I suspect that you may be asking me a question you know the answer to here. You know, my colleagues who are scholars of ethnocracy often point to the United States, right, as a system that was absolutely governance by the few for the few, and has over time opened to be a polity that protects the rights of other groups within the community. Obviously, there continue to be serious inequalities to this day, but we have seen significant progress within our own system. So there is precedent for improvement here, yes.
And you'd say, or would you say that constant interaction and constant effort is probably the most effective remedy that we've experienced?
I mean, there, of course, is the very, very famous quote, power concedes nothing without the demand, right? So I think, you know, this is a situation in which, you know, change doesn't happen from the top. It happens from insistent demands and, of course, from support and solidarity from other actors to the extent they're able to provide it. Yes.
Then I have another question that I'd like to ask, and it's open to all of the panelists. The type of conditions that the US and other countries might impose on the government of Sri Lanka would constitute what kind of things that given aid and comfort of making loans would recommend or suggest what kind of actions and how would compliance be measured? Kind of reminds me of in this country, we put supposedly conditions on things, then forcing compliance. For example, I hear from small businesses, African-American businesses, women-owned businesses all the time that they never get the share of opportunity, say for projects, for resources, for whatever, that it just does not seem to meet expectations. And so I'm wondering what would you say to the government if the US, for example, was going to make a substantial loan or a substantial grant? What should we say to the government of Sri Lanka as a condition?
I can start the discussion off. I think there's a lot. It's a fundamental issue. So, but at least it would be a start. But it could be, for example, tied to concrete reform of the PTA. It has not happened for years. There's been promises. Nothing has happened. Concrete reform of the land situation with benchmarks. In Canada, that's how all government loans are done, right? You have to come back, otherwise it stops, and you have to pay the money back. So any loans given should be tied to movement towards and a movement away from impunity. But I do want to make the point that you can't have any reconciliation unless there is accountability. So there's two aspects to all of this. Move towards reconciliation, but also move away from impunity.
Anyone else? We see what is being done in terms of, and this is a different country, country to country, when we think of what's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia's invasion. Is there anything? Yes, go right ahead.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Maliha was talking about the PTA being one of the conditions that can be, withdrawal of the PTA can be a condition with regard to these matters. I would like to point out something very important. The various countries have been congratulating Sri Lanka for bringing about certain amendments to the PTA. But those are really cosmetic changes that are being discussed. The primary, the most important aspect of the PTA, which is making it a draconian law, is that confessions are accepted as evidence. Solely confessions are accepted as evidence in order to convict a person. So now a person may give his confessions for various reasons. One is force, duress on the part of the police. Other might be in order to save somebody. I have listed about 8 reasons in my judgment in one of those cases in dealing with this. So now the important thing is accepting confessions in grievous offenses is prohibited in Sri Lankan law. It is not part of Sri Lankan law. Cannot make confessions a ground to convict a person. So what should be done is there should be corroboration of the contents of the confessions before the court convicts a person. Now these are not matters which are being looked into by the government. They are now just bringing in cosmetic changes on the basis 18 months detention to be brought down to 12 months detention, lawyers to be allowed to go and see them. I mean, these are not important as far as the PTA is concerned. PTA is a direct. One's confession is accepted as the sole evidence to convict a person. So this is a matter which should be understood, and as a reason for granting loan economic benefits to the country, well, we can insist, withdraw your PTA, then we will consider your request. I mean, that is my view.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Congressman, if I may just add one more point. I think I may be speaking from a very frustrated place, but I also think the conversation kind of have to move beyond what the conditions are and more towards what the accountability may look like, because I think time and time again we have seen this process happen so many times. These conditions have been applied and were tested, even with the PTA, even with the promises and the agreements were made. They were never met. I think this government particularly has gotten so good at speaking the language that satisfied international community. I think from us, from the ground, that we see blatant lies, because none of that reflects, the reality of our lives. So I think we are in a place that none of this is working. I don't have the answers to what the conditions might look like, or what the accountability process might look like. But I think we're just wondering, and I'm thinking out loud, I think with the victim communities, we are wondering why the international community is doing this over and over again. What are the new avenues, right? Like what can we ask? What new things can we ask? So I just wanted to add that. I think these conditions we've talked about several times, but this haven't really moved anywhere. So we might as well start focusing on what the accountability process look like. Will they still get a loan? Or are we all gonna conveniently buy what the government says, or convinced by the language they started to speak recently? So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me ask if any of our audience participants have any questions that you'd like to ask.
Congressman, thank you very much. This is Sam Elangovan. It looks like, a political solution should be there by this time after all these years. Well, the Honorable Supreme Court Judge, Mr. Vigneswaran, what can the US do to bring about a political solution?
Well, US as well as India have a moral duty towards the Tamils, because these were two countries which helped the Sri Lankan government to destroy the LTTE. So when they did so, they were under the impression there was terrorism and it was all terrorism and so on and so forth. The actual reason why our youngsters took up to arms was not understood by these two countries. Now they do understand that this is a perennial question, a problem that we had faced right from the time of independence, and there is a calculated plan by which Tamils are sidelined and the Sinhala hegemony is being set up. So under those circumstances, it is the understanding of this and also the moral duty that goes with the fact that they help the Sri Lankan government to get rid of the armed forces of the Tamils. They should now be able to reverse they should now be able to tell the Sri Lankan government, look, we helped you earlier, but now what about helping the people who have been affected by all what has been done during the war? So US as a country had been doing certain things while it was in the members, one of the members of the UNHCR, but they have a tremendous duty towards the Tamils. So how it should be done, how they could be doing this is bringing pressure on the Sri Lankan government. It is the amount of pressure that is brought into, as far as the Sri Lankan government is concerned, that is the only reason, only way by which they could be asked to be humanistic towards the Tamils. That's it. That's my view.
Congressman?
Yes.
There's a question in the chat box for Dr. Kate Cronin from Dr. Jayaraja. The question is, you alluded that question should be asked whether Tamils were subjected to genocide. Can you expand on the need to investigate that and whether such eventual determination calls for a particular solution for non-occurrence? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think this should be part of the inquiry anytime we see violence by an ethnocratic state against members of a non-majority community, especially when it is clear that people are being targeted on the basis of their ethnic identity. So it's always been a bit strange to me that has not been part of the international conversation around what has happened to Tamils in Sri Lanka. With that said, obviously the evidentiary burden for proving the commission of genocide is very high, so I wouldn't want to give an opinion about whether it is likely to be met. But what I will say, and have said on many occasions, is that it definitely should be part of the conversation here, as it should be in any context like this, where we have seen an ethnocratic state with an extremely ethnically dominated military committing mass atrocities against civilians under the pretext of counterinsurgency.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Congressman Davis, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Grace. I think about the mothers of the disappeared. I'm thinking about them right now. Our Martin Luther King said, peace without justice is no peace. These mothers have been fighting to what happened to their loved ones for thousands of days. They have been protesting and no justice. So as this UNHRC, the resolution is coming to an end, we have to, the next one will come in, we have to come in September. And we need the support of course, our government. US government will help as it has led in the past years. And we need the support of all the more stronger support from our country and the world to fight for justice for those parents. Those mothers, so many of them have died without knowing what happened to their loved ones. They handed over to them to the government. So they are still waiting for justice. And that is one of my passionate issues. And 148,679 people were unaccounted for by Bishop Rayapu's account. We need justice. And we count upon we look upon the full support and beyond with all the other countries to move forward for the justice.
Well, thank you very much, Grace. I too have pondered that a great deal in terms of, will there ever be the acknowledgement of the impact of that activity? And it is indeed troubling. And while I'm speaking with you, I'll also tell you that the gentleman who traveled with me to Sri Lanka did indeed pass away about maybe 2 months ago. And the height of that activity was taking place at that time.
Congressman,
you, Dr. Sam, for your many years of engagement, and you have not stopped. Yes, go right ahead.
okay, Congressman, I have a question for Honorable Justice Vigneswar. How will you compare the sufferings and what's happening in Ukraine now to what happened in 2009 for our people? Any similarities or?
Well, that's a good question. You see, all kinds of nonviolent struggles we had waged against the consecutive singular governments of the annihilation of the Tamil nation. They were suppressed using violence and legislative power. Because of this, our youth were forced to take up arms as a means of thwarting state terrorism with no other option. Our youth chose war because of their self-defense to protect the existence, habitat, identity, culture, and homeland of the Tamil. But unfortunately, due to the then prevailing world order and geopolitics, the armed struggle of our people was misunderstood as terrorism and brutally suppressed. Today, the international media and world leaders say that the Russian occupation of Ukraine is a genocide in which civilians are being killed, evicted from their homes, and given property. So powerful countries demand war crimes trial against Russia at ICC and strict sanctions to be imposed. So these are claims which are, this is what is being said today with regard to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And a similar thing went around at that time, but world did not take notice of it. But the international community is still reluctant to call genocide the massacre of the civilians in the war against the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. The killing of more than 70,000 people, and as Grace said, 140,000 as per what Father Raipu Joseph said, and he had reasons to say so. So the killing of surrendered militants, rape of hundreds of women, and complete demolition of our villages. But still the international community is reluctant to call the 2009 war in Sri Lanka a genocide, in which more than 70,000 people were killed, according to reports by the UN. In just a few months, surrendered militants were killed, hundreds of women raped, and cities and villages were completely razed to the ground. So there is a similarity in the sense world is not treating us the same way that now how they look upon the Ukraine and Russia. So there is a similarity there is a lesson to be taken from the manner in which world is reacting to Russia and the manner in which the world reacted as far as the American government was concerned. So I'm glad this question was put in. Thank you.
Congressman, there is one more question.
The congressman had to leave, but proceed ahead with your question.
Yeah, whatever conditions are put by foreign governments for a loan, the Sri Lanka will put it out to the majority community as foreign powers trying to step on our sovereignty. How do you reach the Sri Lankan public so that things will actually change? Without reaching the Sri Lankan public, nothing will change. Like Anushani said, the Sri Lankan government is really good at talking around anything. Chief Minister, do you think you can take this for me, please?
Sorry, I didn't get the question correctly. Could Danny help me? I can't.
Okay, the question is, whatever conditions are put by foreign governments for a loan, the Sri Lankan government will put it out to the majority community as foreign powers trying to step on our sovereignty. So how do you reach the Sri Lankan public so that the things will actually change? Without reaching the Sri Lankan majority.
This is one of the.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why, despite the fact that the 13th Amendment did not give much powers to the provincial councils, why we wrote a letter to Modi to insist upon the 13th Amendment, at least the elections to be held. Now, as I was Chief Minister, when certain things like this happened, we had a hand in it. We were able to make our contribution, or our opinions were heard. Now, Sri Lankan government saying that foreign countries are trying to come in and then do something. At the moment, Sri Lanka cannot afford to say so, because they are in a economic catastrophe. They are in they are the threshold of bankruptcy. So they need to get the benefits of countries, and it is this time that would be ideal for countries which want to help to tell certain things to the Sri Lankan government and get them to conform to it. Because I remember a German company wanted to do a project in the northern province. When they went into the central government somewhere, to the central bank or so, for it to be passed, some officer there said, "Oh, why are you taking this only to the northern province? Why don't you give it to the south as well? So give about 30% of it to the south, you can take the balance." And that German company, they said, no, this is affected area, war-affected area. We have been asked to only give it to the northern province. Then since there were some problems, they took that money and then I think invested in Cambodia or someplace. So this type of thing is definitely happening. Any form of benefits that are accruing or coming over to the northern and eastern provinces are being scuttled or are being stopped from being materializing. And all this talk about countries trying to sort of intrude into Sri Lanka's sovereignty or whatever it is, those are statements made. But today, the fact is that Sri Lanka needs help from all countries. And therefore, we should be in a position to make use of this opportunity to tell Sri Lanka to change its values with regard to human rights, and then to help the people affected by the war, as well as otherwise by poverty and so on. Thank you.
Hi, if I may add one more thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your question is also about the battle of narratives. How the narrative is being spent in the South and among the similar communities, and particularly among the general public who actually voted for this government. I think the burden shouldn't be on us all the time to change the narrative, or trying to tell them. I think now is the moment, like everybody could see what a failure this government is, and how they built this whole thing on lies. And I think we have to look at two things. One, the civil society in the South and other parts of the country, and how they failed to mobilize the people, and how they failed to mobilize the general public who votes to actually see what this government is. So I think there has to be more efforts on the ground among Sinhalese to understand these dynamics, and to understand what we are asking for is, it's just our basic human rights. It's not their land, it's not their rights. And I think the responsibility falls on civil society outside of Tamils and Muslims as well. We have to share the responsibility. We can't always be the ones, at the forefront of everything. The second thing I think is, if, only if we have a strong opposition to, again, actually to gain momentum and actually make use of this current moment, it could go somewhere. But instead, we are, even among the minority community, we are left with politicians who want to say like something for the Tamil community, and then in the South, it's a whole different narrative. When the dynamic is like that, it's really hard to make use of that as well. So I think it's quite unfortunate we don't have the kind of support from the opposition and also from the other civil societies.